Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn event, sponsored by Florida Power & Light Company and the Free the Slaves organization. I'm Eileen Dees with Florida Power & Light, and I'll be moderating today's meeting. At FPL, we believe in the power of communities to band together to overcome challenges that we all face together. And today, we are pleased to welcome FPL staff, members of the legal community, and the general public to attend today's important session. I'd also like to welcome Free the Slave supporters who are also joining us today to learn more about the issues and how they can help. The Free the Slaves organization is dedicated to helping communities around the world confront and overcome human trafficking and modern slavery. Today, we'll hear from 4 people who are fighting to liberate victims who are trapped in modern slavery and change the conditions that allow human trafficking and modern slavery to exist. Following the formal presentations today, we will have a Q&A session, so you'll have a chance to ask your questions. If you would like to send in a question now, please send it to the email address that you see on your screen, which is florencia.oliveira@fpl.com. That said, we're ready to get started. Our first speaker is Wade Litchfield, Vice President and General Counsel for Florida Power & Light, and he is also a board member of Free the Slaves. Good afternoon, Wade.
Thank you, Eileen, and it's a pleasure to be here to participate in this virtual event. And I want to thank everybody from across the state and even elsewhere in the country who have tuned in to this event to learn a little bit more about this incredibly important topic. Human trafficking is increasingly being seen as perhaps the most horrific human rights issue that we face across the globe and even locally. As I think we all know, it represents really the violation of basically every principle of humanity that as a civilized society we try to uphold and to protect. But it's not just an international problem, and I think among the hundreds of participants that we have today viewing this live and those who will watch this on a recorded basis after, there are more than a handful of you, including myself, who have known individuals personally whose family or nieces or nephews or daughters or sons have been targeted, or whose very family have been targeted. So this is an increasingly local issue for us, particularly in Florida, as well as you'll hear. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from 3 champions in the anti-human trafficking space, as Eileen referred to. So we'll hear from Dr. Timothy Patrick McCarthy, a Harvard professor and board chair of Free the Slaves, and he's going to provide both historic and modern context for human trafficking and maybe describe a little about what modern-day slavery actually looks like. We're going to hear from the executive director of Free the Slaves, Bukeni Waruzi, who will talk about what this leading international anti-human trafficking organization is doing around the globe to combat human trafficking. And we will also hear from our own state attorney general, Ashley Moody. She'll describe what is being done right here at home in Florida, and she'll also help us better identify what we need to know to be able to report human trafficking when we see it, or suspected human trafficking when we see it. At Florida Power & Light Company, we work with the communities that we serve to try to make Florida a better place to live, to work, and to raise a family. And as part of that commitment, we also work closely with partners such as those who have joined us here today and to combat this growing problem. This is a global problem, as I said, requires really attention at every level of government, international, federal, state, and local. As a board member of Free the Slaves, I get to see what this organization does around the globe to try to help at-risk communities move closer to becoming sustainably free from human trafficking and from slavery. And as a resident of Florida, I very much appreciate what our state attorney general is doing to bring a lot more focus and attention to this very, very troubling issue here at home within our own borders. So we're going to have an interesting discussion today, I think, and I would like to kick us off by having us watch a video that has been prepared by Free the Slaves that includes interviews with survivors of modern-day slavery. So thank you.
They offer us fabulous jobs, but they lie.
The boss didn't give us any food. We were hungry every day.
There was a demand for me to service 20 to 30 customers. I was sick and shaking, but I had to service customers. The brothel owner threatened if I don't go into the room, I will be killed.
A man came into our village and told us there was good work available and that we'd be paid well. He told us to come work with him, but when we went there, all we got were beatings. We were beaten all the time.
We know it's dangerous work because sometimes a big storm may come and cover the hole where you are working and kill you. I know one boy who died.
They told my mom they would send me to school. I left home thinking I would be sent to school. It was a lie.
The slaveholder hired men armed with guns and axes, and they guarded us the entire day.
I was kept in chains. That was the most fearful part for me. We were dragged around by the chains. My leg used to bleed because of the chains.
A bonded laborer has to work as a slave to the master. He has no freedom. He is totally at the mercy of the landlord. Working like this, there is no difference between an animal and a human being.
It truly is shocking, at least to me, and I'm sure to everybody who just watched that. It really is shocking to think that this is happening in modern times. Our next speaker is Dr. Timothy Patrick McCarthy, and he is joining us today from Harvard University. He's going to help us understand why and provide information about slavery's historical roots and its global comeback in modern times. Welcome, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Eileen. It's wonderful to be here. I wanted to thank you for that wonderful introduction and for serving as the facilitator and MC for today. I'd like to thank my dear friend and colleague from Free the Slaves Board, Wade Litchfield, for helping to put this together, and to his whole team at Florida Power and Light for doing such a wonderful and professional and terrific job putting this program together. And it's wonderful to be here in conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Bukeni Waruzi from Free the Slaves, and also Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody. Let me just start by giving you a sense of sort of how I came to care about slavery and freedom, how I came to study it and teach about it and write about it, and then also how that helps me to understand the connections to my work with Free the Slaves and how I came to the work with this wonderful modern abolitionist organization. I first became interested in slavery and abolitionism really in earnest as an intellectual or political project as an undergraduate. I was raised, as many of us were in the United States, with textbooks that barely mentioned slavery as part of the history of the United States. And even when they did, it downplayed the profound movement of abolition to engage with and try to eradicate America's original sin, one of the great contradictions of the founding of the United States, a country that was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that they're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so much of the language of freedom and equality and rights that we see at the founding of the country were compromised at the very least by the deep roots of slavery that existed in the United States well before its founding. And so I came to really care about these issues, not just slavery as an institution that represented what I consider to be the greatest crime against humanity in world history, but also the sort of contradictions that lay at the core of the nation's founding, its origin and evolution, and also the movement that began almost as soon as the founding started itself to get rid of this original sin. When I started my career as a faculty member at Harvard University in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I stumbled upon a book called Disposable People, a book that was written by a scholar named Kevin Bales, who, as it turns out, I would find out later on, would become one of the Quad founders, one of the 4 co-founders of Free the Slaves, this organization that is now entering its 3rd decade. And that book knocked my socks off. I read this book, and it was the first really detailed study and accounting of modern-day slavery, not historical slavery that I had been studying and historical abolitionism that I had been studying, but modern-day slavery. So I invited Kevin to Harvard to give a guest lecture to my course on American protest literature, where we were studying slavery and abolition, and he knocked the socks off my students. And that set flowing for me a kind of attention, a recognition that if I was going to study and teach and write about historical slavery and abolition in the midst of a world where there was still slavery and needed abolition, that I needed to connect those dots. And so I became, in those moments, not just a scholar and a teacher and writer about these things, but an activist and modern day abolitionist. Now, one thing I'd like to say right from the get-go is that slavery has existed in some form in nearly every human society that we know of based on the historical records that we have. From antiquity to the present day, slavery has existed in some form in every human society. What it looks like, how it operates, its root causes, and who is affected by it may change over time and space, and that's true in the modern era as well as historically. In the United States, I think our perception of slavery is shaped profoundly by the way that slavery unfolded in the United States, and particularly the way that that slavery unfolded in North America, that becomes the United States, in the wake of centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions and millions of people, there are different kinds of estimates, but anywhere from 12 to 50 million people of African descent, of African origin, mostly from Central and Western Africa, were enslaved into a transatlantic slave trade and brought against their will to labor against their will without compensation to in a whole range of industries to enrich the various colonial and imperial projects of European powers, of growing European powers. And so the transatlantic slave trade of Africans being stolen, enslaved, removed, and transported against their will to the so-called New World predates the founding of the United States by over 2 centuries. And so when we think, oftentimes, Americans especially, when we think about slavery, we think about this as the enslavement of people of African descent in the so-called New World. And an ideology of race, of black people as being subordinate to white people or inferior to white people, therefore justifying the enslavement of people of African descent by people who were of European descent or increasingly considered white in American racial parlance, that this is something that shapes the way that we think about slavery to this day. But I want to be clear that while the system of slavery, racialized chattel slavery of people of African descent in the United States, is one form of many of slavery globally and historically. I wanted to offer a timeline to help us understand a little bit how we get from a transatlantic slave trade involving millions and millions and millions of people to a place where abolition or an anti-slavery orientation as a moral and political project takes hold. And so this first slide offers up a couple of key dates. And I want to be clear that by the time we get to the dates in the late 18th century, slavery already has deep roots in all of the Americas, in North America, South America, and the Caribbean, as well as other parts of the world. But just as slavery had deep roots by the late 18th century, the late 18th century sees also a corresponding rise, initially gradually, and then it picks up steam over time, of an abolitionist movement that was powerfully important in terms of eradicating, of undoing that slave trade, of halting the trade itself, and then ultimately of eradicating and making illegal, right, in the laws of the country, slavery as an institution. In 1772, there was a very important case in England, in the UK, where an enslaved man named James Somerset escaped and then was captured, and then with the help of abolitionists sued for his freedom. And the Somerset case handed down a ruling by Lord Mansfield in Britain, London, that said that the heir of Britain was free, and therefore someone who is enslaved in another part of the world, in this case Boston with origin in Jamaica, and came to London, that he could not then be forcibly removed from Britain back to his point of origin. And so James Somerset becomes free in this case. This was a case that was of limited scope in terms of its ruling. It was a very narrow ruling in some ways, but it was seen as a major symbolic victory for the growing movement of abolition in Britain, and it set in motion a much more profound and powerful political movement to abolish slavery in Britain and ultimately the UK. Around the same time, the United States, the colonies were declaring their independence and forming and forging a new government. Many of the founding fathers of the United States were themselves slaveholders or were implicated in slavery in some way. Not all of them. There were anti-slavery members as well as slaveholders at the Constitutional Convention. And so you get in the U.S. Constitution a kind of a very problematic kind of bargain, a kind of Faustian bargain with this original sin of slavery, with these claims of freedom and the rights of citizenship. So in the Constitution itself are just 3 oblique references to slavery. One about the so-called 3/5 clause about taxation and representation, one calling for the abolition of the slave trade in 1808, and then another one dictating the sort of terms of what happens when an enslaved person escapes from one state to another. So in the U.S. Constitution, there are just 3 oblique references. There's no mention of slavery per se. They talk about persons and so forth. And so the Constitution, right from its very ratification in 1789, becomes this hotly contested text that pro-slavery advocates say ensures and enshrines slavery, and anti-slavery advocates say sets in motion a kind of movement for freedom. At the same time that the Somerset decision is taking place and the Constitution is being ratified, there's a revolution in a colony called Saint-Domingue, which then becomes known as the Haitian Revolution, which was a slave insurrection, the largest in human history at the time that we know of, against 3 separate colonial and European empires, the British, the Spanish, and the French. It's an uprising of African-descended peoples against these colonial powers. They ultimately expel them by violent force and slave rebellion, and it leads to the establishment of the first free and independent democratic nation in the Western world with black people in charge. It was a major kind of moment, not just in the age of revolution and the abolition of slavery, but also in the establishment of black sovereignty, of black democracy in the Western Hemisphere. As you get into the 19th century, there are different calls for abolishing the slave trade, the enslavement and transport against their will of Africans from their native communities and countries to the so-called New World. In 1807, the British abolished the slave trade. In 1808, the United States abolishes the slave trade. But I want to be clear that the trade was abolished in 1808, but that didn't mean slavery was abolished. And so in the United States, at the time of the abolition of the slave trade, the importation of enslaved people to the United States, that started a kind of internal slave trade where the number of enslaved people of African descent in the United States goes from 1.5 million at the beginning of the century, right before, according to census figures, right before the abolition of the slave trade, to 4 million when you get to the eve of the Civil War, which ultimately abolishes slavery. So the number of people who are enslaved in the United States, despite the fact that the importation has been abolished, grows 2- to 3-fold over the course of those intervening decades. Of course, you have the Civil War. First was Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 as a war measure. It didn't have that much of a profound effect in terms of actually liberating enslaved people, but it was meant to be a war measure that shifted the moral terms of the war away from merely saving the Union to abolishing slavery as a central moral and political cause of the war. Then at the end of the Civil War, right before Lincoln is assassinated, you have the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment of the United States, which ultimately abolishes slavery by constitutional decree in the United States. As you get into the 20th century, the war against slavery, the abolition of the slave trade, different kinds of statutes and laws to abolish slavery in different kinds of nation states takes hold, and it becomes, just as slavery had always been a global phenomenon, and the abolitionist movement had always been a global movement, this becomes a kind of global commitment to the abolition of slavery and the prevention of slavery and the slave trade globally. In 1948, in Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, very, very clear and succinct language. It says no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. And then later on in the century, as an anti-slavery commitment takes hold as the kind of law and legislation of many lands, and as a moral and political commitment increasingly embraced by more and more people, you have things like the Palermo Protocols, which introduced anti-slavery and anti-trafficking protocols into the United Nations charters and provisions. And then in the United States, you have the Trafficking Victims Prevention Act, which was brought into law, passed by Congress in a bipartisan effort in 2000, the same year that Free the Slaves is founded. And so these key dates in slavery and abolition can show us not only how profoundly extensive, expansive, and deeply rooted slavery is globally from antiquity to modernity, but we also see over time a growing and gathering commitment, a movement to abolish slavery, to eradicate these original sins, to get rid of these founding contradictions, and then ultimately to embrace, but not by everyone, certainly, but by many, many more people, a commitment to abolition. Let me just go to my next slide, which is a slide that gives us, it's from the work of Kevin Bales, and it gives us a sense of a kind of contrast between what we might call old slavery and new slavery, or historical slavery and modern-day slavery. You'll see in Bales' contrasts and comparisons, and this is a little bit overdetermined and oversimplified, and I want to be really clear about that. But you can see some of the key distinctions between slavery historically and in a modern sense. Legal ownership is asserted in old slavery. Legal ownership is avoided because it's illegal in most places in a newer modern sense. There was a high purchase cost for enslaved people in historical terms and a relatively low purchase cost in modern day terms. There were relatively low profits, although people made a killing literally off of slavery historically. Not everyone had low profitability, but there are increasingly high profits today. $150 billion per year in illicit profits due to the modern-day slave trade. I will be happy to post this slide, but you can see on this slide a whole bunch of contrasts that I think are important for us to understand that point that I was trying to make, that slavery is not static. It changes over time. And just because we think we know what slavery looked like in another time does not mean that we fully understand what slavery is in our own time. And it's really important for us to think about the contrasts and continuities. Some continuities, and I want to sort of close here, some continuities that I think are important is that slavery, regardless of what historical period, our own or in the past, we're talking about, slavery is, as I said, the principal crime against humanity in the history of the world. And there are many through lines. Right? Slavery, whether you're talking historically or in modern day terms, as I said, is a crime against humanity. There is embedded in this crime against humanity a superior sense of ownership. The idea and ideology and practice that one person or people are supreme and therefore have the right to rule over, to subordinate, to enslave, exploit, and control other people. That is consistent throughout history. Also consistent throughout history is the presence of force, fraud, and coercion, not only to exact enslavement, but to produce financial gain. Oftentimes, historically, and in the present day, and Bukeni is going to talk more about this, there are racial, religious, caste, and ethnic justifications for the enslavement of particular kinds of people. And there are consistent root causes that produce or make people more vulnerable to the institution of slavery. And they include war, forced migration, displacement of some kind, climate catastrophes, global pandemics, other kinds of systemic issues that are really, really important. And then the last thing that is true of slavery across time and space is that there is the use of violence to enact and exact that force, fraud, and coercion that prevents or makes it very, very difficult for people to find their freedom and to escape from slavery. Today, as we are here on this program, estimates say that there are almost 40 million people enslaved across the globe. That is more numbers, more people enslaved now, today, this moment, than at any other time in human history. And yet it's the smallest percentage of the global population. It comes with, today, in this moment, as we're talking in this program, comes with $150 billion estimated of illicit profits per year. Slavery is illegal everywhere by statute or by embrace as a kind of moral principle, and yet it's practiced almost everywhere, which means that we have to enter into that paradox, that contradiction, which was not just the founding contradiction of the United States, but it's a founding contradiction of this particular, an enduring contradiction of this particular moment, which calls us all to engage in this movement and to take action. And with that, let me pivot to my dear friend and colleague, Bukeni Waruzi, who is the Executive Director of Free the Slaves.
Thank you so much, Tim. And, of course, it's so impressive, your presentation, which makes it even easier for me. Many things that you have touched upon, I won't have to repeat them. Let me also join you in thanking ASPL and of course, WED for organizing this event, and the whole team at XPL, Arlene and others, which is really, we are grateful on behalf for Free Slaves, how very important this kind of educational event is for us to get some insight and knowledge about modern slavery. An issue, as Tim said, is a great concern of international and local communities. I also want to thank you, all of us. All of you are attending this session today. We are really grateful for your time, and we hope that this event will contribute to the sensitivity you may want to have about this issue. How I get into this, I think it is something that a long story, but I'm going to make it short. As I was, in the middle of a situation that was a war in the DRC, and so many kids were being taken by the rebel groups and the forces and armed forces and used as child soldiers. As you know, a child soldier is the worst form of child labor that exists. So that call to try to help to help release some of these kids that were taken as their parents, we were wondering where our kids, went. Most of these kids were being abducted. They were, their ages were ranging between 7 and 13 years old. So you can imagine a 7-year-old holding a Kalashnikov or an AK-47. It's even heavier than himself. So that's a situation that I had to deal with, these kids being really abducted, which is one of a form of abuse and exploitation, where the coercion, as Tim mentioned, is the rule. So I over 10 years, I was able to get back, to help really release over 360 children, girls and boys, return to their family, and also eventually find some kind of reintegration processes that include taking them back to school. So that was how I got involved, being really aware of how this issue is really widespread during armed conflict situation. Since then, I've been working, on the issue of children that are enslaved, and also when I was exposed to the issue, to working in the Middle East, that's where I find hundreds of women from the global South being enslaved in the Middle East as they work as domestic servitude. that is really, that has helped me open the eyes that this issue is not only local or true for a particular community or region, but it's widespread. But as one of the action that I took was to try to take this issue of child soldier at the International Criminal Court, because he was a crime against humanity, and the International Criminal Court had the mandate to prosecute and to put an end to this. I was happy in 2012, one of the famous warlords in the DRC was sentenced to 14 years in prison for the use of child soldiers in the Congo. Now, today I'm going to talk kind of on three major things. One, I will try to explore the root causes of modern slavery, and also I will try to follow the lead team, try to kind of highlight a little bit the human rights and the policy framework that's happening globally. And I will talk about free the slaves work, in terms of the community work that we do at grassroots level to ensure a resilience and resistance to modern slavery in local communities. And I will try to explore a little bit the nexus between modern slavery and racial justice, not only in the United States, but also outside the United States, in countries like Mauritania or India. As Tim mentioned, we have, there are nearly over 40 million people enslaved around the world. Yes, that is a huge number, but it is even more than that. And that number is even more because of the COVID situation. One would think that, COVID will make people stay home, but actually it has made more people being enslaved. That number does not include the families. We know that the effect or the impact of slavery is not only limited to a single individual. Those single individuals are the 40 million people that are in the statistics. But if you count the families, the communities, you will find, and also the impact of the COVID that has exacerbated the modern slavery, it is here we're talking about, even more millions of people being in condition of modern slavery. Some of the major root causes include poverty, war and conflict. I just explained how I started during a war situation where kids, thousands of children aging, 7 to 13 were being recruited and used as child soldiers. Climate change. You can imagine the effect of climate change that lead to modern slavery when one has to go look for food. Where the communities are starving because of the drought. That will really increase their vulnerability to modern slavery. Or some cultural norms and practices. We know in some of the cultures around the world. There are some practices and norms that really increases the vulnerability to modern slavery. For example, the female genital mutilation. You have in many, so in some societies around the world, they still using that practices. Or even forced marriage. All of that will be, considered forms of modern slavery. And other human rights abuses that we see around the world. That is maybe led by globalization, where some of the inequalities have even increased even more, just because of the rampant nature of human rights abuses around the world. So these are really the major key forms of, key root causes of modern slavery. Of course, we could also include migration, when people want to, look for better jobs, somewhere else. They may be trapped into modern slavery because, that can include forced labor or working for a very inhuman, work pay. But beyond all of these numbers, beyond all of these root causes that now we are aware. What is being done to try to address at policy level or at human rights? And what kind of frameworks exist that we can tap into to understand how we can better address some of these root causes? We know, of course, the United Nations that, United States is a key player. Second slide, please. Where the United States is a key player, some of the instruments that have been, enacted through the United States, the United Nations will constitute some of this, part of this framework. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted on the, on the 10th of July, 1948. This Article 4, clearly stipulates that no one should be held in slavery or servitude, and slavery and the slave trade should be prohibited in all their forms. So this is one example, of a framework that is global. Of course, the United States is the founding father of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The other, instrument that we do have around the, in the United Nations mechanism is the Palermo Protocol. I'm not gonna, spend too much on that because, Tim talked about that. But also there are some United Nations Security Council resolutions. They have implementing forces if, the members of the Security Councils agrees on them. So these are kind of some of the instruments under the United Nations framework. The Sustainable Development Goals, which are a policy and advocacy framework that really brings all the nations. The Sustainable Development Goal in its Goal 8, which takes which calls for decent work and economic growth. In its target 7. It really calls to, for countries and stakeholders to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst form of child labor, including recruitment and the use of child soldiers. By the year 2025, we should make sure we can end, child labor in all its forms. So that is just examples of a policy framework that is current at the United Nations level. And beside that, we also have we do also have the legal framework, which includes the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court that singles out human trafficking as a crime against humanity. Of course, Tim talked also about how modern slavery is really an unthinkable form of crime against a crime against humanity that the world has never known. But also there are some of the regional policies, and of course, one of the also in country policy, for example, the TVPA talks more about that. Next slide. Now, I want also to talk about free the slaves. What, for example, free the slaves, innovative community programming that we want to, implement to increase the resilience and the resistance capabilities of local communities, so that they can help eliminate modern slavery. That's where it's coming, especially in the communities. So what Free the Slaves our approach is to partner with local grassroots, identify the problem, which can be any condition, such as the ones that I just mentioned before, and and also we also develop strategies to increase the resilience and the resistance of these communities in our programming. For example, we use the toolkit that we deploy on the ground, train local partners, work with them on many areas, that includes, building their capacity to use the tools to increase their capacity to resist and be resilient. But also we also provide the resources to these local grassroots partners to make sure they have the means that will help them, implement some of these programs. We also work with survivors of modern slavery to empower them to take the lead, to empower them to be more influential in the local agendas, but also the global agenda as well. We also try to advocate for accountability to many stakeholders, which include at state level, at regional level, and other key players. As Tim said, the business of human trafficking is really one of the most lucrative, business that exists. If you have a business that can bring in $150 billion right after, after drugs and also, armed sales, you have, human trafficking ranks number 3. And we know that this business, no one is immune to this business, but everyone can do something to make it, to address it. We also initiate local research, where we try to develop some kind of key new and innovative approaches to modern slavery. I should also have mentioned that Free the Slaves is part of the Alliance 8.7, or a structure of the United Nations. As I mentioned, the target 8.7, where Free the Slaves is one of the 3 organizations that sit on the global coordinating group. Next slide. Yeah. Now, as I've indicated, there is really a direct link between modern slavery and racial justice. If you explore from the standpoint of the poverty condition, we know some of the racial minorities are the most vulnerable, are the most affected by poverty, and therefore makes their vulnerability to modern slavery much higher. And that is very key as we try to understand the scope of racial justice and modern slavery. For example, in India, you can see the caste system, a system that is designed to keep certain, a part of community at a level where they will be much more dependent, where to make ends meet is very difficult. And therefore, you find part of the members of this community are subjected to some kind of exploitation because they want to make ends meet. Someone will work, in the bricks, for example, without knowing that being paid for the work is a right, not a favor. And being really having a decent pay is a right, not a favor. So we try to work with local community to build the skills to really increase their awareness, to hold accountable, those exploited, so that they can brought to book and respond to their atrocity they're causing to a part of the population or the public. But also, in the U.S., as we know it, racial justice is a big issue. And, because of the poverty, you have some racial minorities that are really prey to modern slavery. So how do we make sure we can advocate for policies that will be much more inclusive and really a narrative that will be also more globally and inclusive? So we need a kind of transformation. We need a transformational and systemic change. So while we have to change the system that really enable, these forms of exploitation to persist, But we have to make sure that systemic change is also transformational. If we want to really address the issue of corruption, address the issue of participation into key processes, we have also to address issues that are happening in other sectors as well. So that is pretty much what I wanted to share with you to today, really, and really to hope that as we leave here, we really take some actions that will make really us be part of the movement, a movement that is designed to end modern slavery in all forms. As Wade and Tim said, modern slavery is an issue even here in the United States, is within our backyard. No one is immune to it. We see it. We may not be able to really detect it on time, but that's not an excuse for not taking action. So modern slavery is a global and a U.S. issue, and we need really, really, really decisive measures and action to make sure it ends. So thank you so much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bukeni and Tim, for your insightful presentations. And now we turn the situation here in Florida, where many of you may not realize is actually one of America's largest hotspots for human trafficking. Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody could not be with us here live today, but she did want to take part of this important conversation.
I'm Attorney General Ashley Moody. Thank you for inviting me to virtually speak with you today. Since taking office, I've made it my mission to combat human trafficking in our state and empower survivors of this horrific crime. Despite many common beliefs, human trafficking is not just an international problem. Human trafficking exists right here in our state. Florida has unfortunately consistently ranked third in the number of calls into the National Human Trafficking Hotline year after year. To fight this horrendous evil, I continue to work with our legislative and state leaders to create changes that help protect our most vulnerable. And I've launched several statewide initiatives to educate and train Floridians on how to spot and stop human trafficking. These initiatives include working with our state and local partners as chair of the statewide council on human trafficking, teaming up with truckers and transportation workers to increase reporting and sending traffickers to prison through my Office of Statewide Prosecution. But my work does not stop there. With Florida being an international travel destination and known for its agriculture industry, criminals from around the globe often try and use our state to sell victims for sex or labor. Florida hosted the 2020 and 2021 Super Bowl championship games in Miami and then Tampa. While we welcomed the economic boon and attention the Super Bowl games brought to our great state, we did not welcome those looking to exploit these events to sell women, men, and children for labor or sex. We worked together as Floridians and prepared. Our efforts paid off. Elected officials and community leaders spread anti-human trafficking messages around town, encouraging more engagement in our fight. Not only did we have 2 great games and a hometown championship, but 22 victims were rescued following the 2019 Super Bowl in Miami, and with the 2020 Super Bowl, the National Human Trafficking Hotline saw a 215% increase in calls. Our awareness and education efforts are making a difference. More Floridians are equipped with the ability to spot signs of human trafficking, and they know how to report it. These efforts would not have been possible without our great law enforcement community and our business partners joining in our fight. We worked with the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles in an effort to engage more truck drivers. And in October 2020, we launched Highway Heroes, a campaign that kicked off by sending 500,000 commercial truck drivers anti-trafficking information. Now thousands of Florida truck drivers are Truckers Against Trafficking certified to help us in this fight. We also joined forces with It's a Penalty to work with Tampa International Airport to place anti-human trafficking messages throughout major travel hubs. Our business community partnerships did not end there. I also worked with Airbnb to provide hosts with information and resources on recognizing the signs of trafficking and how to report it. And for a second year in a row, I partnered with Uber to provide prevention education to thousands virtually by delivering the educational material to people, delivery drivers, passengers, everyone involved. The information included resources to better understand human trafficking and how the crime presents itself uniquely in our communities, and what to do if something doesn't look right. Additionally, the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association partnered with my office and It's a Penalty to provide training to their many hoteliers and members so that they will be ready to identify and report human trafficking. Even the National Beer Wholesalers Association, the Florida Beer Wholesalers Association, and the Beer Industry of Florida joined us in our battle to combat this horrific enterprise. Together with our business and community partners, we have provided human trafficking awareness and training to thousands of people in various industries across our state. COVID-19 changed the day-to-day lives of many, and human traffickers were no exception. I'm proud to say we did not allow this pandemic to falter our path in bringing these criminals to justice and their victims to safety. In 2020, we launched our record-setting Human Trafficking Virtual Summit, full of critical information, resources, and tips for fighting human trafficking. The summit is free and still accessible to anyone inspired to help us in this form of modern-day slavery in our country. You can check out all of the material by registering at humantraffickingsummit.com. While we've made great strides in our efforts to end this enterprise in our state, our fight is far from over. We need strong, compassionate people like all of you to join our cause and help us stop traffickers in their tracks. To get involved in our mission, you can visit youcanstopht.com and learn how to identify a trafficking victim and where to report the crime. If you see individuals displaying fear, anxiousness, paranoia, or reluctancy to discuss injuries, or if there is someone speaking as if they have been coached or having someone speak for them, or they seem to suffer from drug addiction, infections, or sleep deprivation, please report it to local law enforcement or call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. Everyone here can play a vital role in our mission to stop human trafficking and become an integral part of our team. By joining our cause to end human trafficking, you can make a monumental difference in the lives of so many. And you can help us ensure a person is never again forced against their will to serve another. And you can play a hand in rescuing maybe even a child or reuniting someone with their family. The task is a difficult one, but I believe each and every day, if you're up for the challenge, we can really make a difference. With the help of your hard work and dedication, we will one day see a Florida and a world where human trafficking no longer exists. By joining together to end human trafficking in our state, we will build a stronger, safer Florida.
Thank you very much to the Attorney General and her entire team for all of their dedication. So that actually concludes our formal presentations for today, and now we can get to some of your questions that have been submitted. I actually have a question already, so I'll go ahead and kick things off, and this question is for you, Wade Litchfield. We have actually heard a lot about what individuals can do and how they can help, but what can companies like ours do?
Well, Eileen, that's a great question, and I think as we've watched the presentations today, hopefully there's an interest in the first place. We've tuned in. But we're also asking those questions, what can we do, and maybe what more can we do? So in the case of FPL, we've done a series of lunch and learns over the years. We've done events in the past to help educate both our employees and our communities as to the dangers and the risks of human trafficking. But in the what more can we do category, we're currently undertaking an initiative to train and educate our line workers and field crews. We obviously have a lot of people who are on a day-to-day basis out in the field with their primary objective of keeping the lights on, they also, if they're taught what to look for, can notice things that are a little bit amiss, a little bit askew, and help be better eyes and ears for law enforcement, when they're out servicing the lines and the wires to keep the lights on. So that's one thing we're doing.
I think that's great. And we have received a lot of questions where people are just frankly asking what can they do and who do they call. So I just want to reiterate what Ashley Moody mentioned. So if you do suspect something or you see any suspicious activity, the best thing to do is to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and I'll repeat that number. It is 1-888-373-7888, but it is very important to keep in mind that if you think that anybody is in imminent danger, you should call 911, which is the best thing to do. We do have another question that came in actually from the audience today, and this is for our speaker, Bukeni, and the question is, what is the link between COVID-19 and human trafficking? You spoke about that a little bit, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you so much, Ali, for your question. Yes, there is a direct link between COVID-19 and modern slavery. For example, you can imagine someone being, that cannot go out, to kind of do very traditional activities that he used to do. But while the traffickers will be able to identify that person, and the person will be keen to join very easily, because no one is watching, has nowhere to go in, even to escape. The only route he has is to go to the traffickers who are trying to take them. So the fact that people aren't showing out, cannot go out just indoor because of the lockdowns, it becomes a very easy way for traffickers to identify, to target, and to train someone from point A to point B, meaning from the origin to the destination, and the reporting mechanisms become very limited. So that's why the COVID-19 makes it very difficult for the reporting to happen timely, but it makes it easier for the traffickers to identify and to train someone into a route that the person wants the person to go from point A to point B. That is a very short answer. I can give that, but there is more explanation that I can provide.
Thank you. Tim, this question is actually for you. Can you tell us, are there governments that are actually supporting human trafficking or modern slavery, and not just businesses that are enslaving people?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. I mean, more often than not, governments are guilty of neglect or turning away from the work that they need to do, trafficking and modern slavery, right? You don't have the same kind of engagement and complicity of governments in a modern context as you had historically with European powers, the United States, and others that I mentioned earlier. But there are countries that are more complicit and more invested in the practice of trafficking and slavery. For instance, in China, which is a country that has a whole range of human rights abuses and violations to its record, is engaged in and presides over forced detention centers, particularly exploitation, enslavement, and violence against the Uyghur minority in China. Currently, North Korea practices slavery and trafficking, or sending citizens of North Korea abroad, keeping them under control, collecting their salaries so that whatever they're compensated for in terms of their labor work, they do not get to keep. Here in the United States, we're seeing there's a growing movement within the anti-trafficking, anti-slavery space, and also within immigration justice and racial justice organizations and folks who are working to call attention to and shine a light on the abuses of industries like private prisons, even government-run prisons and immigration detention centers, and how the government of the United States, in the way that it's implicated in and perpetuates both mass incarceration, which is a huge crisis, a racial justice crisis, a class crisis, and also immigration and deportation kinds of detention and exploitation. So there are ways here in the United States where the movement is trying to call attention to the kinds of things that could be defined as human trafficking and modern slavery, and also things that are forms of exploitation and crimes against humanity that flow into those kinds of realities.
Thank you, Tim. We are running just a little longer than we anticipated this afternoon. However, I'll just go ahead and ask one final question if everybody can stay with us, because it is an important one, because some of this is a little confusing. Bukeni, this is for you. What actually is the difference between slavery and trafficking?
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. The distinction is not very easy to make. Modern slavery is defined as the fact to coerce or to exercise power and coercion onto someone to execute the task even unwilling, or to put someone in condition where he has no way to escape but really be at the mercy of the person, of the exploiter. Now, human trafficking, can lead to modern slavery because you try to make sure to take the person into a situation where the person is not necessarily comfortable in. So they that transfer from the location to another one, that is trafficking. So human trafficking, it becomes kind of a conduit that can lead to actually modern slavery, where you have this coercion now becomes a normal. So as we do the definition between the two, the distinction is really not very easy to make because they are very much intertwined. So you can traffic someone and the person will end up into, for example, slavery conditions. So it is, one will lead to another one. So that is very much, how the two really work.
Thank you. That's important information for everyone to hear. That is all that we have time for today, but I'll close with this and I'll answer one of the questions that we receive the most, which is really, how can I help? Here are some simple things that you can do to help. First, spread the word. You can use Free the Slaves information from their website. They have films and handouts that you can use for your own lunch and learn session, just like this one, whether at church or at your job, at work, or you can even use the materials for your school projects. You can find those materials on freetheslaves.net. You can also finance freedom, not slavery. You can contribute to organizations like Free the Slaves that are working on the front lines. You can also think about the products that you use. We are all connected through the things and the different products that we buy. Look to buy fair trade or fair good program products. And you can also invest your 401k into socially responsible funds. You can also become an advocate. You can become an advocate for abolition. And remember, this year, 2021, is the National Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. So we can all do our part. I thank all of our presenters today for attending and all of the important information that you provided, as well as I thank everybody who is attending and our wonderful audience who is able to be here with us today. This meeting has been recorded and it will be available for playback within the next few days. If you are attending this session for CLE credit, you will receive an email with additional information. This does conclude our meeting. Please be well, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.